Hello, everybody. I am honored and excited to be interviewing Suzette Brooks Masters for the City Biz audience. She's a lady who has a lot to offer to our audience related to the democracy as it stands in America today and the future, which is the most important. Suzette is a Harvard Law graduate and a graduate of Amherst College, and she's presently a senior fellow at the Democracy Funders Network and the director of DFN's signature project called Better Future Project, which we'll be talking about considerably. And she has a wide range of experience in the field of democracy. She advises foundations on many subjects in the area. So, Suzette, thank you for joining us. I'm honored to have you on this interview. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Well, maybe we should start with what I mentioned, which is something called, and I believe it was published 2 years ago now, "Imagining Better Futures for American Democracy." I know it's a detailed research report, but why don't you start off there, and we'll take it from there.
Great. So, a couple years ago, so I would say it was early 2022, I was feeling pretty down about the state of our democracy and some of the conversations that were happening in the field that were primarily about defending the system that we have, as opposed necessarily to fixing the problems that we have and imagining what could come next. And it was really affecting my mental health and the conversations I was having with the people around me. I was usually the Debbie Downer in any room, wringing my hands about how we were going to save our democracy. And then a light bulb went off. I started thinking about, well, who's not depressed and who's not thinking about the bleakest outcomes, but actually building what's going to come next. And it's probably all around us. We just can't see it. And so for several months, I started looking for those people, what I call them positive disruptors, the people that were building what was going to come next and trying to figure out how to connect to them. Were there networks of these people? Were there listservs that I could join? Were there writings that could inspire me? And one thing led to another, and I wrote a concept paper that had begun to catalog some of these disruptors and their ideas. And I pitched it to the Democracy Funders Network. And I said, you do great work, but it's primarily defensive and reactive. And I think that's not enough. And we need to think about what comes next and how do we build towards something more hopeful and better than what we have now. And that was the genesis of the Better Futures Project. And it was the genesis of this report that you mentioned that ended up being very wide-ranging, much more work than I ever imagined it would be. Probably the longest paper I've written since my third year paper in law school. But it enriched me so much because I ended up talking to such a wide array of people across the ideological divide in different fields, different ages, different identities. And I was asking them what their aspirational futures were and whether they thought that our democracy was going to be able to get us there and what needed to change in order to make that possible. And in the course of that, I discovered whole new ways of thinking about the future and how that could completely change the way you think about the present. And so it was a very life-changing and mind-bending effort, and I'm really proud of it. And it continues to animate the work that I do today.
And in that research, I mean, there are countless ways to reform our democracy or bridge the divides and find common ground. Is your vision of the brighter future, the better future, is Is that path, I assume it's not one answer. Is it more focused on democracy reform and legislation? Is it more focused on cultural aspects of people getting along better? Or is it a combination of everything?
I think there are many, many paths to better futures. I think one of the challenges that we face, and I'm sure you're going to recognize this because I know a lot of the work that you've done is to try to create a very large tent for many people doing different kinds of work to feel like they're in common purpose, strengthening our democracy in a variety of ways. And so I would say the same thing applies to my research. There's a wide range of ways that we can improve our democracy, but we have to distinguish between reforming an existing system but keeping most of the system the same, and what it looks like to actually reimagine the system itself and how it will function. And so I think I was trying to create a container for aspirational thinking that could encompass everything from structural reform to narrative change to mindset change within individuals and organizations and systems and institutions as big as government, to rethink how we move from here to a better there, as opposed to having more of an attitude of, we gotta hold the fort. We can't give an inch. I don't think that's what we need right now. I think we're in a period of such dramatic and rapid change and disruption and chaos that one natural reaction when you have so much chaos is to double down on what you know because it feels safe. But in fact, what you need to know at times like this is both to understand the limitations of the current system and also be open to the new possibilities ahead, because it's rare for a crisis in a time of chaos to leave you in exactly the same place you were before that chaos started.
Well, I'm curious about something because I know this from personal experience that your writing has, it's 2 years now, 2022, I believe, has been read extensively by many people I know in the field, the reform, democracy, healthy self governance field. And I imagine many of them have communicated with you. Is it, would you say it's a work in progress that through the dialogue you've had as a result of the first, is there a part two that's going to come out? Is it an ongoing thought process? How does it evolve?
So, what I would say is, first of all, I was really gratified that people affirmed the need to think about what comes next and that we need more hopeful narratives. And we also need better networking of the good ideas that are going to help us get to the next stage to one another. The siloing that happens, for example, in the structural reform movement, I'm sure you're well aware, there are people that are going to die on the sword of one form of reform and will never entertain another form of structural reform. I am quite comfortable with a whole bunch of different reforms being tried and seeing what works at a given point in time. But I believe that we need to be much more welcoming of a variety of possible approaches. There is no one silver bullet. So I think one of the main things that our report highlighted that I think had been under emphasized in the past is the toxic effect of dystopian narratives. It is really, really hard to imagine a highly functioning, well oiled machine of democracy and of the government in service of a healthy democracy when all you see in the media, all you consume are either stories of dysfunction, stories of failure, stories of conflict. And when you talk about the future, you're seeing, a bleak landscape, survivalists barely hanging on and no functioning government to speak of, or a horrible surveillance state, right, that is oppressing you. How can you imagine a better version of what we have now if all you're being fed is this really awful diet? So I think we've underinvested as a movement in figuring out what those positive narratives could look like and how to balance that out with all this dystopia, you know? Um, the only other thing I would say is what part two looks like is probably not another report. I mean, what I'm happy about is at least this report has more than a 2-year shelf life. I think I think it's somewhat evergreen for at least a few more years, and I think it hopefully is starting a conversation about what good ideas are out there and how we can think more positively about the work that's happening and reframe it in a more positive way. That's where I've had the most traction, I would say, is with individual folks working on these issues saying, I never thought about it, but you're right. Like everything I do when I write to my constituents or I try to solicit funds, it's all using fear and crisis and urgency. And I'm not really framing any of my work in terms of this is going to lead to better outcomes. This is about building a better future for people. And so I've seen several people that I know reframe the outreach material that they use, talk differently in their speeches, and think more intentionally about, well, what does building a better future look like in my organization, or how can I practice what I preach in my own work, right? And how I approach a problem. So I think it's got legs. I think it's got different kinds of legs, whether you're an individual trying to change a mindset, whether you're an organization trying to rethink how you structure your work, how you develop a strategy, how you develop a way for your staff not to get burned out because they're so depressed all the time about all the battles. And then also more systemically, how do we unify a field around some shared ambition and some shared visions of the futures we want to create together and stop all the, there's a lot of scarcity mindset in the fields that we work in, right? People are competing for limited funds. They're trying to differentiate themselves from one another, often with not that much differentiation. We probably need a whole lot more consolidation in the field than there is now, to be better equipped to tackle some of these problems. But I think the direct answer to your question is I think I'm still disseminating it, trying to embed some of the lessons from the report into the way people think and the way people act.
Well, some of those lessons, whether it's directly from your report or just a realization, when you spoke of competing ideas in the reform movement, I happen to be aware, involved to some extent in an organization called the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. And when they started, after years of these different concepts competing with each other and actually speaking badly at times of each other, whether it's open primaries or ranked choice voting or final five or whatever, this realization came that we all have to work together. There is no single one answer. So you're onto something. Hopefully, the democracy, well, not hopefully, I am keenly aware of a change in mindset related to that. I believe in your bio that you did some consulting related to philanthropy. Was it related to philanthropy in the democracy field specifically, or in other areas of philanthropy?
I was a grant maker for a decade, and I worked on immigration and immigrant integration. So I understand some of the pressures that philanthropy faces in doing its work, developing a grant strategy. And so after I left the foundation I was working at, I spent some time consulting with a number of other donors on issues like social cohesion and pluralism. I helped with some of the early thinking on the New Pluralists collaborative, and advising a number now of democracy donors from my perch at Democracy Funders Network. So I would say that's been a consistent through line probably for quite a few years now since I left the foundation in 2016.
Right. Well, we have a lot of business. This is City Biz, and a lot of the audience are business people who might have no idea on how to get involved and what they could do. Do you have any words of wisdom for them? Someone who listens to your interview and wants to think about the future and wants to make a better future. What do they do? How do they get involved?
Well, I think that business is actually primed to do a lot of this thinking as well, because some of the things that I'm most excited about now around strategic foresight and the use of futures thinking, right? To imagine different possible scenarios for the future and then to work backwards to think about, well, what does that mean for how I should behave in the present? And I think there are many businesses that have strategic foresight units so that they can think about how to become more resilient in the case of shocks that are unexpected, or how to take advantage of opportunities because they see them coming before other people. They track them. You know, a signal becomes a trend becomes something you want to pay attention to, and you might reorient how you structure your business or how you market or how you organize yourself, right? And so one of the biggest users of strategic foresight was Shell. And they used it to really manage the 1970s oil shocks better than their competitors, right? And there are a number of companies that do that. So I think the bigger question is, how do we get business to engage in thinking about strengthening our democracy, because they view it as something to be valued. I'm not sure all businesses view a strong democracy as essential. I would argue that I hope that they come around to believe that that's going to be the case. We have not experienced true authoritarianism in the United States in our lifetimes. And I think some of what could potentially be down the pike, depending on the outcome of the election, could be something we have really never seen before in this country. And at least not in the 20th or 21st century. So I would caution business to think hard about, you know, if you want better futures for your employees, for your children and grandchildren, to think hard about what are the intangibles that democracy brings us that we've taken for granted. And until 2016, most of us didn't even pay attention to democracy and its stability. We thought it was a given. I was trained as an economist in addition to being a lawyer. And one of the weirdest things about economics is they tell you to hold variables as constants, right? So you do all this formula making and you hold the most important variables constant, right? Well, the truth is they're not constant. And the stability of our democracy is not something we can take for granted and hold as a constant. We have to work on it and make sure that it survives. So I don't know if that's appropriate for me to plug the importance of business supporting democracy, but I think every sector in America, every sector needs to be supporting our democracy.
And certainly an important sector is the citizens themselves, the leaders and in your report, are the changes happening? There are innovations now that come to mind for you to improve civic engagement, to help citizens realize that it's more than just voting. I mean, voting is critical, but any thoughts on how we can get citizens more engaged and involved in our democracy?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, David, because I think you and I know that democracy is about more than voting. But unfortunately, I feel like our entire approach to democracy has been collapsed into voting. And I think that's been really to our great detriment. Because what we've done, and I'm speaking here for democracy donors, I'm speaking for people that spend inordinate amounts of money around elections, but not at any other time, that they've really distorted what democracy is and what the practice of democracy is. People are not going to vote for the most part unless they feel invested in the system. And America has very low rates of voting. I mean, compared to other advanced democracies. So there's nothing to feel proud of in terms of the very low percentages of people who actually turn out. And I think that's because there's this growing disenchantment, right? Like the act of voting doesn't seem connected to anything that really affects people's daily lives. And we've stopped speaking of the issues that are at stake in a way that people can relate to. And we have lots of problems with the way our democracy functions. That means that even if you do get people to turn out to vote, they may not feel that that vote mattered or that it affected their lives in any appreciable way. So over time, I think you lose people, right? They either sit on the sidelines, they're disgusted with the process, they feel like it's somebody else's problem. That is a huge problem for our democracy. So I think trying to browbeat people into turning out to vote every 2 or 4 years is not the solution. It's very instrumental, it's transactional, it will not last, it will not change people's views of the efficacy of voting. What I think we need to do is we need to revitalize all the things that happen between elections. And I know you agree with this as well, but we need to figure out ways to engage citizens in matters that affect their daily lives, where they feel they have agency and where they feel like their actions led to something concrete changing, right? And so I am intrigued by some techniques that have been used outside the US, very little in the US, but I think have a lot of promise, like citizens' assemblies, like participatory budgeting, but with meaningful amounts of money, right? So that you really have a chance of steering the direction of where government resources are going, not really nominal things. I also think there are some techniques, again, mostly used abroad, that can enhance the way our public meetings function, so that they're not mostly essentially a pre-litigation NIMBY process, right? Where the only people that show up are the people who are for or against something on the agenda. But can you actually make it a place where people want to come together and solve problems for their community together and imagine what their community could look like that's aspirational, right? We don't really have meetings like that, but we could. So I think there are a lot of those types of interventions that could really re-engage people. But the problem is they're new. We haven't had a lot of them. They cost money. So we need to make the case to lots of donors, as well as city and state governments, that these things are worth investing in, because over the long run, they're going to change people's perceptions of their government, rebuild trust, and hopefully rebuild that sense of agency that voting alone, I don't think, provides.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you a personal question. Uh, the obvious passion you have for our democracy. Uh, when you were at undergraduate school or law school, or growing up in elementary or high school, is there anything from your early life experiences that you think uh, led you to the direction of your life is in now about democracy, or is it something you grew into through the education process? That's a tough one. I know.
Well, I would say it may be neither one of those. Like my mother is an immigrant and became a naturalized citizen a couple years after I was born, and I do remember her voting in every single election, right? Every primary, and New York City has a lot of elections for not very exciting races, but she would take me into the voting booth, and so she modeled the importance of that. But I think, honestly, if I'm going to be really candid with you, I was taking democracy for granted until 2016. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I assumed it would persist. I assumed it was embedded in our culture and in our practice. And that was wrong. That was not true. And so I realized that every single issue that I cared about for myself, for my children, for hopefully one day grandchildren, depended on having a democratic system. And so after 2016 happened, I realized that everything else mattered less than ensuring that we had an enduring democracy. And given the rise of authoritarianism in general, globally, we're in the middle of what I would say is a global democracy backslide. There are maybe, there's variation, obviously, and there are some bright spots and some less bright spots. But generally speaking, I think we're probably at the end of an era. And it's unclear what comes next. And we're going to have to fight like hell to preserve what we have and to evolve into something that works better. Because part of the backslide, I think, is a reaction to the fact that our democracies haven't delivered that well for a lot of people. And so, we have to stare that squarely in the face and deal with it. So the answer to the personal is, I think it's really a wake-up call and realizing that pretty much everything that I believe is important hinges on the existence and the survival of our democracy.
Well, maybe only one thing I can disagree with you when you said it's unclear what the future holds. I feel that if more people read your writing, Better Futures for American Democracy, they will have greater clarity. And hopefully that lack of clarity that so many Americans feel in their heart and soul will be lessened as a result of the great research and work you're doing. So thank you, Suzette, so much for the offering the CityBiz audience an opportunity to learn more about your work. Thank you.
Thanks so much.